You know, I like how he says this in verse 37. He said, "The Lord will deliver me from the Lord that delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear. He will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." You know? It's like, go ahead, the Lord be with you. I hope it works out. And Saul didn't believe that. You know, and honestly, there was a couple things working here, but I'm going to give you my interpretation. This is Jason's interpretation of what's going on. I think Saul believed if his army saw some little boy get ripped to shreds by this giant, they'd finally all get up and do something. So I think that's kind of what's going on here. I don't really think Saul expected him to do what he did. And one of the things I thought was interesting here in verse 38, Saul clothed David with his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with his armor. And David girded his sword around his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these things, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. He couldn't. It was too heavy for him. He couldn't handle it. He wasn't used to it. It wasn't something that he was used to. And so he took a stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even his pouch, and his sling in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And, you know, some people say, well, why did he grab 5? You think he's going to miss? You know, what if I missed? Now, you know, I don't know. I mean, I've heard some things, and this is kind of, I like digging into the Bible and finding kind of interesting, deep things. I mean, it does say Goliath had brothers. It really does. I mean, it says he had 5 brothers. There were 5 giants from Gath. Goliath was just one of them. He might have been the oldest one, you know, but there were others. You know, I probably figured once I knocked this one down, his brothers might come and try to fight me. He was ready for the other 4, you know. That is possible. But he grabs these smooth stones, and I like, you know, you think you're coming at this giant with just a slingshot basically and some stones. You have to. I mean, he knew it didn't matter what he had. He knew that God would use what he had in his hand. That's, you know, see, this is the thing that's trying to say. It didn't matter, you know, whether he had a sword or whether he didn't. Whether he had anything or didn't. I mean, God, he knew God can use what he had. And he was giving it over to God. Now look at this. And look, he says here, let's go. So the Philistine came on and approached David, verse 41, with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistines cursed David by his gods. And the Philistines said to David, "Come on, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." You know, and it's kind of interesting because then David turns out, you think, you know, David's standing there. This is this giant that when he spoke, it freaked the people out. And I like how it says that Goliath used to come and he would taunt the children of Israel night and day. You know what's interesting? That part of their religion, part of what they believed as, you know, Jews, is they had to go out and pray 2 times a day, at nighttime and at daytime. It was a requirement. You ever read through the Bible where it says at the time of prayer, or at the time of this, it's because every day they went out and prayed 9 days. So I think it's kind of interesting that Goliath would go out and taunt them during their times they were supposed to be praying. You know, they'd go out and start probably saying, "God, there's this giant out here," and Goliath would be standing there yelling at him. You know what's funny? That when your problem's yelling at you like that, it makes it a lot harder to pray. You know, because the way our perception is, because the way we see it. When we see a problem as this giant that's just going to kill us, you know, no matter how much you try to pray, all you're going to be hearing is that giant yelling at you, you know. That's why you can't do that. That's why sometimes there is a time to pray and there's a time to act on your prayer. You know, David knew that there was a time to pray, and he had his time to pray out in the wilderness. And when he was out there as a shepherd, he prayed. You know, he was a man after God's own heart. I mean, he spent time with God. But when it was time to act, it was time to act. He knew he had to shut this giant up. And so the giant said, it's kind of interesting. Goliath says to him, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Because he sees this little kid running at him with the, you know, little shepherd's staff in his hand and a slingshot. You know, like, what are you going to do? And it says he curses him by his gods. And I like how he says, "I'm going to give your flesh to the sky, to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." Look at this in verse 45. So David says to the Philistine, "You come at me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come at you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the army of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down, and I will remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the armies of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord, and he will give you into my hands. I like that. David this is covenant talk. This is words. This is a man who believes what he's saying. Because I'm going to tell you what, you're not going to get up in front of some giant that's so huge that he has some little guy carrying a shield in front of him. I mean, this is like a big man. And come up to this guy and start talking smack like this unless you know you can do something. And I like how he one-ups him here. Goliath, he's saying, I'm going to do this. And he's like, well, guess what? I'm not only going to feed your body to the birds of the air, I'm going to feed the whole army. I mean, he was not playing games. And I always think it's interesting when you read this stuff, you think, man, this is the kid's story they tell in children's church, about some guy wanting to slice some giant's head off and feed his body to the birds of the air. The Bible's not rated G. Okay, I want to get to the point here and finish this up. And I want to point this out to you here real quick before I go to this next scripture. Notice David is saying something. Did he have to answer Goliath for God to work? Well, some people don't know. He said something. He said, this is what is going to happen. Now, number one, how did he know this was going to happen? Well, you can say, because, God told him so. Well, there were a lot of gods running around during that time. Basically, they weren't really gods, they were demons. The Philistines served their God, who they believed their God told them to do something. A lot of different little gods running around saying things. But how did David know that God was going to do what he promised he would do? How could David stand up and say, because he was a circumcised Jew, because he stood on the covenant, and he knew that when he said these words, he knew it was going to come to pass because of the covenant. He knew there was blood on it. So when David stood up to this Philistine, he didn't just believe that God, he said something. The problem is, and people, it's just not believed as much. It's not, people don't understand it. Like, the power of life and death is in your tongue. It is important that you speak. It's important that you say what your covenant promises you. His covenant promised him that this giant would fall before him. It's important that you know what the words of your covenant are, so when you speak those words, you can know that what you say will come to pass.